Disclaimer, this is probably going to be an unorganized mess of a video. I just need an outlet of some sort. While there are Monster Hunter games dating back to the PS2's heyday, 3 Monster Hunter games are generally referred to as the new-gen Monster Hunter games, the games which are so different from the predecessors in how they look and play that they're considered their own little group. World, Rise, and the latest entry, Wilds. Also, great job, Capcom. Now anytime I see someone write something about MHW, it takes me a minute to figure out which game they're talking about. I have my likes and dislikes about all 3 games, but now that I've finally rolled the credits on Wilds and played a few hours after that point, I can confidently say that among these 3 games, Wilds is my least favorite. I still like it and would play Wilds over most other games, but not nearly as much as the other 2. I think it's a really good game being held hostage by trying to be something it isn't, and I say that for a lot of little reasons and one big reason. I'll say up front that the act of hunting monsters is still fun, and in terms of combat, for the most part, the hunter is as capable as they've ever been. Also, I apologize for the way my hunter looks. This is what can happen when you use a random number generator to create your character. I used a longsword the entire time and was able to pull off some smooth-looking spirit/helmbreaker attacks that felt damn good to perform, even if the maxed out spirit gauge effectively behaves similar to the special trick bar in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. Yes, I did just make that comparison. And being able to pick up and throw barrel bombs is my absolute favorite thing to do to a monster now, whether it's asleep or awake. But I also realized something along the way. The hunter was made stronger, but the monsters weren't. In fact, they got weaker. Since World, it's become clear to experienced players that the monsters, sometimes even at the highest ranks, were becoming slower, telegraphing attacks much more strongly, and pausing much more often. Wilds only exacerbates this, to the point it sometimes feels patronizing, even in high rank. The life bar telling the hunter when a stronger or feint-inducing attack is in range of them only makes it harder for the monsters to pose a threat to the player. Adding to this are the Palico almost never leaving the battlefield. In older games they would have to leave to recover for at least a minute, and the ability to carry a different secondary weapon. I mained the longsword, but I added a heavy bowgun as my secondary, and proceeded to not use it at all. If I did, I would have been able to fire from the back of the Sacred at a distance and strafe damn near every monster to death while being in little or no danger. Slinger ammo other than stones is plentiful pretty much everywhere and usually deals noticeably more damage than before. The wound system makes knockdowns or staggers much easier and happen much more often. Side note, I do like that it says what monster material you get for destroying these wounds. Other side note, I never used the focus mode and still destroyed wounds constantly. It seemed pretty pointless. The result of this is that most of the time when I slayed a monster, I didn't feel like I accomplished much, even though I was playing solo the entire time. It was just another thing to do so I could move on to whatever the next thing was. I'm glad I played solo because, based on what I've seen from my friends trying to play this, the multiplayer in Wilds can be unnecessarily complicated and sometimes not work for unknown reasons. Above all else, I'm really glad there's finally cross-platform play. But whoever spearheaded the design for this, never put them in charge of the game's multiplayer again. As for my single-player run, it wasn't until a few monsters from the end of the game that I saw either a pin maneuver or my longsword bouncing off part of a monster. I'm making somewhat of a deal out of this, not just because of my skill level. I'm not bad at Monster Hunter, but I'm not exactly great at it. But because for the longest time, my character was wearing absolutely no armor. His defense was 1 up until the Ray Dow fight. I was planning to make armor when I started struggling to survive hunts, but even in high rank, my character still doesn't have any armor for his chest or waist and is doing just fine. Even against monsters I never faced and didn't know what to expect, I often didn't faint a single time and completed quests in under 15 minutes, with several not even lasting 10 minutes. What makes this more frustrating is that the environments in Wilds look great. The monsters in this game are mostly new designs, though some clearly borrow moves from other monsters, and they also look great. Well, except for the one that looks like a clown's misplaced balloon animal. And the Wudwuds do just look like if the cast of Bug Snacks went feral. I feel absolutely nothing for these abominations. There's also a form of visual impact where you can see parts of a monster distend a bit when they're hit with a melee weapon. I think that more so than the number damage makes your weapons feel much more impactful. The music is also really good, except for the Quest Complete track, which made me drowsy more than anything else. On the sound front, I'm still bitter that Monster Hunter language isn't a selectable option for two reasons. One, it was an option in every other Monster Hunter game except this one. And two, we know from the beta that the characters do talk in Monster Hunter language around the base. Yet they don't do it here and it's not a selectable option. What happened? I'm getting sidetracked again. One of my points is that these three games, Wilds, Rise, and World, are also where it became clear that Capcom is trying to make the game easier to get into for outsiders. People who hadn't played the series at all, or only played it very little, or only recently. And anytime I brought something up that I didn't like about how the games worked, I would hear, well, it's designed as an entry point for new players. As if the games before this one weren't also designed as entry points for new players. They were, by the way. But there are parts of the design in Wilds which make the game either borderline insulting to the player, or unnecessarily difficult for someone who's new. For the former, the game starts with a dramatic run through a pack of monsters to rescue a little girl. That sounds cool, but it's also a sequence which is impossible to fail. You automatically move forward, the monsters always miss no matter what you do, and when there's a prompt to press a button, the game will slow down and even stop entirely until you press it. Look, if we're going to give other games hell for doing this, Monster Hunter should also be fair game. Sequences like this happen multiple times through the low-rank quests. I never thought I would see tasks which are straight up impossible to fail in a Monster Hunter game, but here we are. Then there's the autopiloting of the Sacred. These things will automatically move to objectives during both hunts and the heavily scripted walking sections. The game will constantly force the player to walk in a certain direction, either by forcing them to turn around and yelling at them to go toward the objective, or taking control away from the player entirely. Sometimes you can use the slinger to grab items if you're close enough, but that's it. These are unskippable, by the way. Monster Hunter World had a couple sequences like this too, but the hunter could go wherever the hell they wanted, as long as they met up with the NPCs again at a certain point later in the map. Wilds effectively puts the player on a leash and forces them into a really boring rail shooter, giving them less of a chance to see the environments and learn the lay of the land. Which, if the player was allowed to do that, it's less likely they would need the Sacred to autopilot them everywhere. Sometimes the game also won't let you run or won't let you use any equipment in these sections. It's straight up put down the controller and do something else material. As an aside, I don't dislike them, but I'm not much of a Sacred fan. They're fine for what they are, but I just came off of a Monster Hunter with Palamutes, really fast dogs you can ride which also help attack monsters and don't require unlocking gestures to play with them, and where the hunter could wall run for several seconds and use wire bugs to zip up mountains and launch across several parts of the map. Sacreds never stood a chance against that. Though this game does force you to ride them to get through certain parts of each environment. A great move considering sometimes my Sacred would take a solid 10 seconds to find me and often pick me up and slam me into a wall. There are also certain long-time features of past Monster Hunter games which would massively help newer players, but they're either mishandled or not present at all. Farming is a staple of both older and more recent Monster Hunter games. I mean farming in a more literal sense, being able to hand over one item like an herb, a mushroom, or a bug, and have a farmer or trader come back with several more of them after a quest or two. Great for both vets and newcomers, but for whatever reason, Wilds doesn't have this. Both World and Rise have multiple campsites which can be built for each map, all of which are active simultaneously and can be fast traveled to at any time. Wilds instead has the base camp and a pop-up camp to place in certain areas, a camp which can/will be destroyed by monsters. Decorations in Wilds are divided into attack and defense decorations and can only be used in either weapons or armor respectively, while World and Rise let you use any decoration in any piece of equipment with enough slots to hold them. Capturing monsters is a long-standing feature that's insanely useful to both new players and longtime vets. If a monster is weak enough, you can catch it in a trap, hit it with a couple tranquilizers, and the monster is captured, ending the quest early. Even if the quest says hunt or slay, capturing still counts as succeeding, and it sometimes gives extra rewards. It's also really easy if the monster limps away and falls asleep. If that happens and you have a trap and 2 tranq bombs, the quest is basically over the moment the monster dozes off. I actually did this in Wilds a couple of times on my own, and it's a good thing I did that too, because do you know when Wilds bothers telling the player that they can capture monsters? After the credits roll. The game doesn't even have tranquilizers or tranq bombs at the supply shops. It's like they're pranking newbies by deliberately hiding this from them. Food bonuses in World, Rise, and several games before them were obtained by eating at a canteen which had ingredients found in the field and were in infinite supply, giving bonuses until either the player fainted or the quest ended. Wilds only has food bonuses if you have the ingredients in stock, and they run on a timer. I lost track of how many times my food bonuses ran out in the middle of a quest, lowering my maximum health and stamina, and I had to retreat to set them up again. Also, there's way less food porn in this Monster Hunter. You're mainly cooking from your camp, and while it's cool that the ingredients you choose influence what the cooking animation is, the food itself simply cannot compare to what was in World. The only thing more awkward than the food bonus thing was the amount of times I had to comb through the options menu to turn off a bunch of presets that were making the game more annoying to play. The camera locking in place when I didn't want it to, nauseating motion blur, the sacred running when I didn't want it to. It still did, even with the options for that turned off. It's good that so many options are there to turn off and on, but the default settings for them were bizarre at points. Then there's the structure of the game itself. For comparison, here's how most of the other Monster Hunter games work. You have a few basic quests you do before getting into the heart of the game. Go into the field and gather items, hunt a few small monsters, and hunt your first large monster. It's slower paced for sure, but it's a gradual ramp up in difficulty which gives the player a chance to get the basics of the game down before facing the first major threat, while also getting used to navigating around environments. After all, the hunters people play as in those games are usually not that experienced. The guild wouldn't have them go after big targets right away if they were. Wilds' first quest is a large monster hunt, which is followed by a gathering quest, which is followed by a small monster hunt. Aside from the strange pacing, in terms of importance, this teaches the player the game mechanics out of order. While there is a training barrel to smack around beforehand, I still watched some people who weren't familiar with Monster Hunter try this first quest and absolutely flounder because they didn't have a chance to fight anything smaller and have the chance to get used to reading attacks, dodging, and blocking. That wasn't a problem on my end, obviously, but what was a problem was the monster AI breaking and running into a wall repeatedly. Yes, my game was up to date with the patches. The other issue is with how Wilds handles progression, and this is the big problem that I mentioned earlier. Here's a rough illustration of what progression looks like in the Monster Hunter games before Wilds. There are a few quests that absolutely need to be completed called key quests, and these quests, often involving monsters a player hasn't fought yet, can be done in any order the player wants. Once those are done, the hunter goes on what's called an urgent quest, again, usually against a new monster. Completing this moves the hunter up one rank and the cycle repeats. Another set of quests, another urgent quest, and so on. Monster Hunter Wilds doesn't do this. The basic structure is listen to people talk, hunt one specific monster, listen to people talk, repeat. The most common objective in this game is talk to insert name here, and it has the balls to give optional objectives which are also usually talking to someone and present no reward. My favorite thing is when the game gives the supposedly optional objective of getting ready for the next inevitable hunt. The point here is that Wilds' progression looks like this. You have no choice in how to approach progression, you can't hunt anything you haven't already encountered, and you don't go at your own pace. You're just walking down a single hallway for several hours. It's the Final Fantasy XIII version of Monster Hunter. Yes, I just made that comparison. This also means that every quest is effectively an urgent quest. And when every quest is an urgent quest, none of them are urgent quests. And having the words "Mission Complete" flash on screen after already seeing the Quest Complete graphic 1 minute earlier makes it seem like the game is congratulating the player on sitting through the post-quest dialogue. And the whole chapter breakdown thing is totally unnecessary as a progress marker. That's what the Hunter rank is for. Things do open up and become a lot more fun upon reaching high rank, but it's such a slog to get there that this game approaches the "once you're 12 hours in, it gets really good" category, usually reserved for RPGs that one friend keeps nagging you to play. I did say that the environments and the monsters look great, but there's a surprising lack of attention to basic details in other areas. For one thing, the opening sequence playing before you choose a primary weapon means that you're a greatsword hunter no matter what. Gemma is somehow at the center of two confusing oversights. This game has pre-rendered and in-game engine cutscenes, and the latter tend to look a little off, either because of weird-looking mouth or head animations, or there being weird pauses in the dialogue that give me Bloody Roar 4 flashbacks. Yes, I just made that comparison. But then there's Gemma, who in the middle of one cutscene just walked on screen and stood with one leg in a flaming cauldron while having a casual conversation with a villager. She also has her own unique animation when forging equipment, but there's a problem with it. No matter what you tell her to make, the animation always shows her making a sword. Whether you ask for a bowgun or a helmet or a hammer or a pair of boots, Gemma's response is always,
"You look like you want a sword."
And then there's the story. Normally, if a Monster Hunter story isn't that good, it doesn't matter as much because there usually aren't that many cutscenes or dialogue-heavy segments. Those get reserved for more important or impactful moments. That is not the case here. Wilds is absolutely packed with cutscenes, in-game walking sections where you're listening to people talk, and forced dialogue selection events. Not dialogue selection like Elder Scrolls or Mass Effect, where you can actually change how the person behaves toward you, it's just soliciting different types of information. I'm fairly confident I spent more time watching and waiting for these to finish than I did hunting monsters in Monster Hunter. And at one point in the game, it starts using a specific word or phrase I won't mention so often that in my head I started likening it to the baby. This became Monster Hunter Other M. Yes, I just made that comparison. This is in part because they decided to give the hunter a voice, something the other games did not do. I know a few people who absolutely hated this design choice, because the silent protagonist approach lets the player effectively make their own characters with their own ways of behaving and superimpose them on the silent protagonist. But here they're stuck with a hunter who, and this is the reason I don't like the hunter having a voice, has all the personality of uncooked spaghetti. Not one line of dialogue the hunter says needs to be said or should be said by the hunter. It's thousands of words amounting to nothing. This is supposedly an experienced hunter and a couple references are made about their past, but they don't go anywhere and don't seem to affect the hunter's behavior. And with the way certain characters fawn over the hunter and how awesome they are, even if they haven't actually done anything yet, I'm pretty sure that if you just turn the script into a written story, people would mistake it for self-insert fanfiction. And the personality problem is not just a hunter issue. Very few characters in this game exhibit anything resembling character, and a good 20 to 30% of the dialogue across the board could be removed without changing anything story-wise or character-wise. Capcom thought to give pretty much everyone unique names, but forgot to make them at least as memorable as past characters with names like The Man, Ace Cadet, or Handler. Alma is probably the worst offender in this regard. In all the time I've spent playing Wilds, I've seen maybe 30 seconds in which she's not just a walking audiobook that alternates between encyclopedia and instruction manual. For Alma and the Handler role specifically, she's up against characters like the Handler from World, who while annoying at times has boundless enthusiasm and an appreciation for good food, and the absolutely unhinged Guildmarm Sophia from Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate, a lady who went bankrupt trying to join elite research teams, stalks hunters in the field, allegedly does some crazy stuff when she gets drunk, and likes some of the monsters a little too much. At one point she tells the player to track down a guy she met and tell him she loves him because she was too shy to do it herself. The guy she's talking about is a Brachydios. When stacked up against past characters in the same role, Alma is a slice of white bread among 3-course meals. I think this is symptomatic of something else going on with Wilds. The writing for most of the characters seems extremely dry and joyless, including and especially when it doesn't need to be. It also seems like parts of some scenes are just missing. At one point, a guy named Eric is wandering through a forest gathering traces of a large monster, only to get nabbed by said monster and held captive. The cutscene makes it look like the other people in the hunting party are looking right at him when he somehow disappears. Then when he gets rescued, there's practically no follow-up about what just happened to him. Later on, the party gets cornered in a cave by a group of monsters. They decide to camp there, and in mere seconds, they nearly have an entire base camp set up. Did the monsters just not mind them sneaking out and back into the cave several times to move a few tons of supplies? And if they could get all these supplies, why didn't the hunting party just leave the cave entirely and go back to the main base camp? They won't show anything that explains these obvious gaps in the story, but they will show flashbacks to things that happened less than 1 minute ago. But this all assumes that the dialogue actually works. I've seen several instances of individual lines simply not playing when they're supposed to. For me, the cutscene right before the credits rolled had 1 or 2 lines in it that were completely silent. You know, I just went on about the characters and storytelling and realized I never mentioned what the basic story is. Here's what's going on. There's this group of people called the Keepers, and they got attacked by a monster simply known as the White Wraith. Nata, the only known survivor of the attack, was found by the Hunters Guild on a survey mission along the periphery of a territory known as the Forbidden Lands, a place they largely have not explored and didn't know people lived in. I would question how they all speak the same language then, but let's just ignore that. The end goal is to find and deal with this monster while also finding out what happened to the Keepers. Said end goal shifts multiple times, but that's how it starts out. From here, the game moves through different environments and into different villages and settlements, introducing characters I think I'm supposed to care about, but who either don't have enough time to build empathy or are too busy vomiting exposition or filler speech. Nata ends up taking center stage at several points and is the one character who has anything resembling growth over the course of the game. But he makes enough terrible, nonsensical decisions and says enough idiotic things that by the 9-hour mark, I was ready to just throw him back into the desert he almost died walking across. It also didn't help that several key plot points, including those related to Nata, were resolved with absolutely no fanfare or gravitas. If the game's not going to care that much about him, why should I? Normally I'll play to the credits in a Monster Hunter game at least twice, or get close to it. With the way this game is structured, however, I have zero desire to spend over 15 hours being dragged from talking point to monster to talking point. Even when mashing through dialogue and skipping through cutscenes, there's still way too much filler and poor pacing in the field dialogue and the forced walking sections, which bloat the in-game time. Wild spent the first dozen hours telling me what to do, and I spent the first dozen hours repeatedly telling the game to go fuck itself. I'm not going to say don't buy or play Wilds. One, because based on the sales data, there's a decent chance you already have it. And two, because when Monster Hunter Wilds actually lets you hunt monsters, it's fun. It's really fun. I just wish it would do that much, much more often.